The morning Theresa Merritt finally decided to write back, the stagecoach rolled into Calico Creek, with a man she had not seen in 3 years sitting on top of it like he owned every mile of dusty Arizona territory road between here and the rest of her life. She had been standing on the porch of her father's dry goods store with a blank piece of paper in her hand and a freshly dipped pen, the ink already drying in the heat of the August morning, the year 1883 sitting heavy on her shoulders like a wool coat in summer. She had been working up the words for 3 years, drafting them in her head every night before she fell asleep, and every morning she had decided they were not right, not good enough, not honest enough, not something she could actually fold into an envelope and send. So the box under her bed had grown heavier with each passing season, full of his letters but empty of her replies, and she had told herself that one day she would find the perfect thing to say. That day had apparently arrived about 4 hours too late. She saw the dust first, the way everyone in Calico Creek saw anything coming, because the land was so flat in every direction that the horizon was a kind of telegraph all its own. A brown cloud rising from the eastern road meant something was moving, and moving at speed, and when Theresa shielded her eyes with the hand that was not holding the useless sheet of paper, she could make out the shape of the Butterfield stage rocking and swaying on its iron springs. She had not been expecting anything today. Her father was expecting a shipment of flour, but that came by wagon from Tucson on Thursdays, and this was Monday. There was no reason at all for her heart to begin its strange climbing motion in her chest. Yet there it was, something about the angle of the light, or maybe some deeper instinct she had spent 3 years trying to ignore, made her fold the blank paper in half and slip it into the pocket of her apron. She leaned against the porch post and watched the stage slow as it rounded the bend past the livery stable, the driver calling down to his horses in that profane and tender way that only men who truly loved animals ever used. The door opened before the stage had properly stopped, and a man jumped down into the street with the easy, long-legged grace of someone who had spent so much time moving through the world on horseback that his body had simply decided all surfaces were equally navigable. He landed in the dust, straightened, pushed his hat back on his head, and looked around Calico Creek with the slow, deliberate consideration of a man taking inventory. He was taller than she remembered. Or maybe she had simply let him shrink in her memory, so that thinking about him did not take up quite so much room. His shoulders were broader and his jaw was sharper, and there was a scar along his left cheekbone that had not been there before, pale and clean-edged, as if it had been given to him carefully rather than in haste. He was wearing a dark canvas duster despite the heat, trail dust on his boots so thick it had gone past dirt into something closer to geography, and his hands, when he pulled his hat off to wipe the sweat from his forehead, were the same hands she had always known, long-fingered and competent-looking, the kind of hands that could gentle a frightened horse or fix a broken wagon wheel with equal ease. Cornelius Graves stood in the middle of the main street of Calico Creek and looked exactly like every letter he had ever written her. He looked like the particular shape of longing she had been carrying under her bed in a wooden box for 3 years. She dropped the pen. It hit the porch board with a small wooden knock and rolled toward the edge, and the sound was enough to make him turn his head, and then his eyes found her, and Theresa Merritt felt the full consequence of 3 years of silence land on her all at once like a summer rainstorm. She had met Cornelius Graves in the spring of 1880, when she was 22 years old and he was 25, and the encounter had been entirely unremarkable on the surface. He had come through Calico Creek with a cattle drive, one of a half-dozen cowboys working for an outfit out of Texas, and he had stopped in her father's store to buy tobacco and a new pair of gloves, and he had paid with exact coin and said thank you and tipped his hat, and she had thought, that is a man who knows how to be polite without being hollow about it. That was all. He had been in the store for perhaps 12 minutes. But he had come back 3 days later, when the drive had moved on without him, because apparently one of the cattle had broken its leg in a ravine north of town, and the whole unhappy business of dealing with it had put the outfit a day behind. And in the meantime, Cornelius had found himself at loose ends in Calico Creek with nothing to do but think. And apparently what he had thought was that he would go back to the dry goods store. He had not bought anything the second time. He had leaned against the counter and talked to Theresa about the country between Texas and Arizona for 2 hours while her father pretended to be busy with the account books in the back room. And when he left, she had stood behind the counter for a long time thinking about the way he described the landscape, not as something to travel through, but as something to actually see. The way a prairie in winter light was a specific kind of beautiful that had no other name. The way a river at dawn looked like someone had unrolled silver cloth across the earth. He had come back a third time on the morning he was leaving to catch up with the drive, and he had stood at the counter again and talked less. And when he finally said goodbye, he had paused at the door and turned around and said, his voice very careful and very even, that he would like to write to her if she would permit it. And she had said yes before she had finished thinking about what yes meant. And then he was gone. The first letter came 6 weeks later from somewhere in New Mexico territory. It was 3 pages long, and it was about the country and the cattle and 2 other cowboys named Pete Dillard and James Acaffer, who apparently argued about everything from the correct method of roping to the existence of God, and had become Cornelius's primary entertainment on the long drives. It was funny and observant and warm in the particular way that some people could be warm without ever saying anything directly sentimental. The way you could tell someone was offering you their real self without them having to announce it. Theresa had read it 4 times in a row and then put it in the box she had found under her bed, which had previously held her grandmother's lace, and which now held something she valued considerably more. She had meant to write back immediately. She had meant to write back the same afternoon. She had meant to write back the following week when she had thought of a better response than the immediate one. She had kept meaning, and the letters had kept coming, and by the time 2 months had passed she had 8 letters in the box and not a single word sent in return. And the longer she waited, the more impossible the first reply became, because how do you start? What do you say? How do you explain the silence to someone who is writing to you out of nothing but faith and hope and the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided something matters to him? She had written drafts. She had many drafts. She had written, "I am sorry for not writing sooner," and crossed it out because it was inadequate, and "I have been thinking about what you wrote," and crossed it out because it was vague, and "I do not know how to explain myself, except to say that every letter you write makes the next reply feel more important and therefore more impossible," and crossed that out because it was too honest and frightening. She had filled and burned more pages than she could count, always returning to the blank white face of the paper like a woman returning to a door she did not have the key to open. And meanwhile Cornelius Graves had kept writing. Through 1880 and into 1881 and through 1882, letters postmarked from Texas and New Mexico and Kansas, and one from Colorado that had clearly been rained on in transit. The ink smeared in places so that she had to guess at words, and had decided she was perfectly qualified to guess, because she had come to know the shape of his thinking well enough to fill in what the water had taken. He wrote about the cattle drives and the men he worked with and the towns he passed through, and occasionally, carefully, he wrote about her, about remembering the way she had looked standing behind the counter with the morning light coming through the store window, about wondering whether she liked the Arizona winters or found them too cold, about hoping she was well. He never demanded a response. He never said, "I have not heard from you," in a way that carried accusation. He simply kept writing, with the patience of a man who had decided to be patient, and that patience had been the thing that undid Theresa Merritt more thoroughly than anything else could have, because she had no defense against it. By 1883, she had 31 letters in the box. 31 letters and not a single reply, and she had been 25 years old in April, and summer had come on hard and fast, and this morning, this particular Monday in August, she had woken up with the conviction that she was going to write back today. That today was the day she was going to stop being afraid of the thing she felt and simply put it into words and send them out into the world and let them land where they landed. And then the stage had come around the bend, and Cornelius Graves had stepped out of it into the street, and the world had rearranged itself around this new fact with a completeness that left Theresa standing on the porch with a pen on the ground and a blank paper in her pocket, and absolutely no idea what came next. He was walking toward her. He was walking toward her with that particular long-legged stride of his, not hurrying, not slow, just moving with intention, and his eyes had not left her face, and Theresa became suddenly and acutely aware that she was wearing her oldest work apron and had flour on her hands from the bread she had started baking before the urge to write had overtaken her. And her hair was pinned up in the quick practical way she did on working mornings rather than the careful way she sometimes did when she was thinking about the possibility of being looked at. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. She looked down at him from the height of the top step, which gave her maybe 3 inches on him, and those 3 inches felt very important in the moment. "Theresa Merritt," he said. His voice was the same. She had worried in her more melodramatic late-night moments that she had invented his voice, that the warmth she remembered in it was something she had constructed from wishful thinking. She had not invented it. It was exactly as she remembered, low and unhurried, with that slight Texas edge that rounded the vowels without quite drawling them. "Cornelius Graves," she said, because she could not think of anything else, and her name in his mouth had made her tongue forget its other functions. He looked at her for a long moment and then looked at the pen lying on the porch board and then looked back at her. "Dropping something?" he asked. "I was writing," she said, and then immediately wished she had said anything else, because that was the worst possible thing she could have said given the circumstances. Something shifted in his expression, something careful and unreadable that she recognized from the letters, the way he moved around a difficult thing before addressing it directly. He reached up and picked up the pen from the porch step where it had rolled to the edge, and he held it up between his fingers. "Were you?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I was about to," she said, which was more honest and worse. He set the pen on the porch railing between them. "Well," he said, "I suppose I saved you the trouble of finding a stamp." She did not know what to do with that. It was not accusation, and it was not forgiveness, and it was not quite a joke. It was just exactly what she might have expected from 31 letters worth of Cornelius Graves, which was that he would take the most impossible situation she had given him and meet it with something that was neither anger nor false lightness, but something more like the honest recognition that some things are complicated, and it is better to begin than to stand at the beginning forever. "You should come inside," she said. "It is going to be 100 degrees by noon, and you have been traveling." "I have been traveling," he agreed, and he picked up the worn leather bag he had set down at his feet and came up the porch steps and followed her inside. Her father, Harold Merritt, was behind the counter sorting a delivery of canned goods, and he looked up when the door opened and then looked at Cornelius, and then looked at Theresa with the careful expression of a father who has been watching his daughter keep a box of letters under her bed for 3 years and has been wise enough not to say anything about it. "This is Cornelius Graves, Papa," Theresa said. "He came through in the spring of 1880 buying gloves." "I remember the gloves," Harold Merritt said, which was not true but was the kind of thing fathers said. He was a lean, weather-lined man of 55, with Theresa's same dark eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who had been running a store in a small Arizona Territory town long enough to have seen more or less everything. He came around the counter and put his hand out, and Cornelius shook it with the directness that Theresa had always recognized as something real about him. "Mr. Merritt," Cornelius said, "I wrote to your daughter a number of times over the past few years. I should have written to you as well to introduce myself properly. I regret that I didn't." Harold looked at him for a moment. "You planning to be in Calico Creek for a while?" he asked. "If circumstances allow," Cornelius said, and he glanced at Theresa with a look that made it very clear what circumstances he meant. Harold nodded slowly, the way men in the Arizona Territory in 1883 nodded when they had formed an opinion and saw no reason to complicate it. "I'll put some water on," he said, and went to the back room. Theresa led Cornelius to the small table near the window where her father did his accounts on quiet afternoons, because it was the only place in the store that had chairs that were not for customers, and she sat across from him and looked at him in the full light of the window and thought about 31 letters and 3 years of mornings waking up with every intention of writing back. "You should know," she said, "that I have every letter you ever sent me." He settled his hat on the table and folded his hands. "I figured you might," he said, "given that you never wrote back to say you didn't want them." "I wanted them," she said. "I wanted them very much. I want to explain why I didn't write back." "You don't have to," he said. "I want to," she said, "because you deserve the explanation and I have owed it to you for a long time." She looked at her hands on the table, the flour still on her knuckles, and then made herself look up at him. "Every time I tried to write back, it felt like the words weren't enough, not because I didn't have anything to say. Because I had too much, and I didn't know how to say it without it being the most frightening thing I'd ever done. And so I kept waiting for the moment when it felt less frightening, and the letters kept coming and the moment never came, and then this morning I decided that I was going to write today no matter what, and you arrived." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that careful, unhurried attention that she recognized from the letters. "What were you going to say?" he asked. "If you'd written." She felt the heat in her face that had nothing to do with the August morning. "I was going to say that I have read every letter you sent me more times than I can count," she said, "and that I know the shape of how you think about things better than I know most people I see every day. And that I don't know if that constitutes knowing someone, really, but it constitutes knowing something, something that matters, and I have been holding it under my bed in a box for 3 years because I was afraid of what it meant if I said it out loud." He looked at her for a long time. Through the window, the main street of Calico Creek went about its business, a wagon rattling past, a dog investigating the water trough outside the hotel, 2 women in bonnets walking with baskets toward the mercantile on the far end of the street. The ordinary Monday of a small town in the Arizona Territory, with nothing remarkable about it except that it had entirely rearranged the landscape of Theresa Merritt's heart. "That's more than I could have hoped for," Cornelius said finally, and his voice was very quiet, the way things get quiet when they are carrying more weight than they want to show. Harold came back with water and a pot of coffee he had been keeping warm, and the morning moved into the kind of ordinary that felt extraordinary. The 3 of them sitting in the dry goods store talking about the drive and the road and the state of the territory, while Theresa held in her chest the knowledge that the man across the table from her had written to her 31 times out of nothing but faith, and that she had been too afraid to answer, and that he had come anyway. He had taken a room at the Calico Creek Hotel, which was a generous name for a 2-story adobe building with 5 rooms, and a proprietor named Mrs. Adeline Fitch, who was approximately 70 years old and ran her establishment with the authority of a general and the hospitality of a grandmother. He had arrived with a horse that had been loaded onto the stage at the last town, a bay mare named Dust, who was apparently the most sensible animal Cornelius had ever owned, according to Cornelius, who clearly felt strongly about this. He came back to the store that afternoon. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and within a week it had settled into a pattern that felt as natural as anything Theresa had ever known. Him coming in mid-morning after tending to Dust at the livery, helping her father with the heavier deliveries because Harold's back had been giving him trouble and he would not admit it to anyone who had not already noticed, eating lunch at the small table with Theresa if the store was quiet, talking about everything and nothing in the way that two people talk when they have 3 years of correspondence between them. And it is finally taking on the dimension and texture of a real conversation, rather than the flat surface of a letter. She showed him the box on the third day. She had not planned to. She had simply gone into her room to fetch her shawl on a cooling evening when he was on the porch talking with her father, and she had looked under the bed as she always looked. The way you look at something that has been the center of your private life for so long it has become as automatic as breathing, and she had thought, he is 20 feet away from where I have kept his words for 3 years, and something about that proximity made it impossible to not tell him. She brought the box out to the porch. It was a plain wooden box, not particularly large, with a small brass latch that had gone green at the edges. She sat down in the chair across from him and set the box on the small table between them, and her father excused himself with the transparent and kind-hearted diplomacy of a man who had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. Cornelius looked at the box. "Is that it?" he asked. "That is it," she said. He did not reach for it. He just looked at it with the particular expression she had been learning to read, the one that meant he was feeling something that he was being careful with. "May I?" he asked. "They are your letters," she said. He opened the latch and lifted the lid. The letters were in there in rough chronological order because she had been unable to stop herself from organizing them, tied into small bundles of 5 or 6 with pieces of ribbon from her sewing box, a pale blue for the early ones and a green for the middle ones and a deeper navy for the most recent. He looked at them for a long time without touching them, and then he looked at her. "You kept all of them," he said. "Every one," she said. "Even the one from Colorado that got rained on." "Especially that one," she said, because it was true, because the smeared and guessed-at words of that letter had always felt like the most intimate thing he had sent her, as if the water had stripped away some outer layer and what was underneath was more raw and therefore more real. He reached into the box and took out one of the bundles, the middle green-ribboned ones, and held them without untying the ribbon, just sat with them in his hands for a moment, and the evening light was going amber and long across the porch, and somewhere down the street someone was playing a fiddle, a slow and slightly melancholy tune that the warm air carried just far enough. "I wasn't sure," he said. "Every time I sat down to write, I wasn't sure if you were getting them or if you were reading them or if you had moved on entirely and were too kind to tell me to stop. But I kept writing because stopping felt like giving up on something I wasn't ready to give up on." "You should not have had to wonder," Theresa said. "I should have written back. I am sorry that I didn't." "You don't have to keep apologizing for it," he said. "I know," she said. "But I want you to know that the silence was not indifference. It was almost the opposite." He looked at her steadily in the amber light, and she felt again that particular sensation of being seen that she had first felt in the store 3 years ago, the feeling that he was not looking at the version of herself she showed the world, but at something underneath it that she was not always sure was visible. "I know that now," he said. "I think I knew it then. That's why I kept writing." The fiddle down the street shifted into something more lively, and the first stars were beginning to press through the darkening sky, and Theresa looked at the man across from her and thought that she was done being afraid of the size of what she felt. She had been afraid of it for 3 years, and it had cost her 3 years of not saying it, and he had come anyway, and the thing she felt was still there, still the same shape, still too large to fit in a letter, which meant it was time to stop trying to fit it in a letter. "I would like to take a walk with you," she said, "if you are not too tired from the road." He set the bundle of letters back in the box and closed the lid. "I am not too tired," he said. Calico Creek in the evening had a different character than Calico Creek in the day. The heat subsided enough to be merely warm rather than punishing, and the dusty main street softened in the blue dusk, and the noise of the day, the wagons and the livestock and the occasional dispute between neighbors about property lines or water rights, quieted into the more human sounds of suppers being eaten and children being called in from play, and the low murmur of conversation from the hotel porch. It was a town of perhaps 300 people, small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and large enough that you could occasionally pretend otherwise. There was a blacksmith and a livery, and the dry goods store and a hotel, and a saloon that also served as the town's de facto courthouse when Judge Pemberton came through on his quarterly circuit, and a small church that served 3 different denominations on a rotating schedule, and a school that Theresa sometimes helped with on Fridays when the teacher, a young man from Ohio named Mr. Calloway, needed assistance with the younger children. She and Cornelius walked down the main street and then turned east along the road that ran toward the creek itself, which gave the town its name. The creek was low in August, not much more than a ribbon of brown water between pale banks, but it had cottonwoods along it that were beautiful, and the sound of moving water even at low summer volume was something that soothed the desert-adjusted nerves. They walked along the bank without hurrying, and the conversation found its own current, moving from the practical and present toward the deeper water of the real. She learned things about him that the letters had sketched but not fully drawn. He was the second of 4 children, his parents having come from Georgia to Texas before the war and stayed after it because there was nothing to go back to and a great deal of open country in front of them. His father had died when Cornelius was 17, a quick and unremarkable death from a fever, and after that he had gone to work to help keep the family together, which meant cattle, which meant the long drives north and west that had eventually brought him through Calico Creek in the spring of 1880. His mother was still in Lampasas, Texas, with his youngest sister, who was 20. His other siblings had scattered, one brother to Kansas, another sister to New Mexico with her husband. He had not been driving cattle for the past 8 months. He told her this quietly, watching the water in the creek. He had saved enough over the years to buy a small piece of land in southern New Mexico territory, 40 acres in a valley that had good water and decent grass, and he had been working it, or trying to, with an older man named Gideon Walsh who had more experience with cattle ranching than Cornelius and less money. And together they had built something that was not yet much but had the bones of being something. 24 head of cattle and a cabin and a barn, and plans for a kitchen garden in the spring. "Why are you here then?" she asked. She asked it gently because she already suspected the answer and wanted to hear him say it. He was quiet for a moment, watching a cottonwood leaf drift downstream on the thin water. "I've been writing to you for 3 years," he said, "and I've never heard back. And I could have kept writing, but I got to a point where I needed to know, one way or the other, whether the thing I was holding onto was real or whether I had built it entirely in my own head." He paused. "I needed to see you. I needed to have the conversation in person rather than in letters, or rather than in the silence where the letters went and never came back from." She stopped walking. He stopped a half step after her. "Cornelius," she said. He turned to look at her. They were standing close, closer than they had been on the porch or in the store, the casual distance of a walk having narrowed without either of them quite intending it, so that she could see the pale line of the scar on his cheekbone clearly, and the way the last of the evening light made his eyes look darker than they were. "I should have told you this in the first letter I wrote back," she said. "Which means I should have told you this 3 years ago. I am telling you now instead." She took a breath. "I fell in love with you somewhere between the 6th and 7th letter. I have been in love with you since somewhere in the winter of 1880, and I have been afraid to say it because it seemed like an enormous thing to put in a letter to a man I only spoke to twice in person. And then the longer I didn't say it, the more enormous it became. And now here we are on the bank of a half-dry creek in August of 1883, and I am telling you that I love you, which I should have told you years ago, and I am sorry it took this long." He looked at her for a moment that felt very long and was probably not long at all. Then he took both of her hands in his, the long-fingered, competent hands she had always known from the letters, and held them at the level of their hearts. "I drove the stage 4 days through territory that has not improved with acquaintance," he said, "to find out if this was real. I think I have my answer." She laughed, because the relief of it was enormous, the way the air comes back into a room that has been shut up too long, And then she was not laughing, and he was not either. And the cottonwoods moved in the small night breeze, and the creek ran its quiet brown course. And Cornelius Graves kissed Theresa Merritt on the bank of the creek that gave the town its name, in the warm Arizona Territory dark of an August evening in 1883. And it was everything that 31 unanswered letters had been building toward. The weeks that followed were, in Theresa's experience, the best weeks of her life, and she was not given to that kind of superlative, having always thought that people who declared things the best of their life were generally overstating in either direction. But there was no other honest description. Calico Creek in the late summer of 1883 was a landscape she had known all her life, and the presence of Cornelius in it was like someone had turned up the light on something she had always seen in half dark. He was good with her father, which she had suspected from the letters, and which turned out to be exactly true. Harold Merritt was a reserved and independent man who had been running his store and raising his daughter alone since Theresa's mother had died of a fever when Theresa was 13. And he did not warm quickly to most people, but he warmed to Cornelius with a speed that told Theresa everything she needed to know. They talked in the mornings about the territory and about ranching and about the particular difficulties of the decade, the growing pressure on small landowners from larger cattle operations, the question of water rights in the dry South, the slow and often unjust process by which the Apache, who had been the people of this land for far longer than any town or any store, were being displaced. A fact that her father discussed with the plain-spoken moral discomfort of a man who knew injustice when he saw it and did not have the power to fully correct it. Cornelius listened to these conversations without flinching from the harder edges of them. He had seen enough of the territory to know what was happening, and he said plainly that the treatment of the Apache people and the other indigenous nations of the Southwest was a wrong that would not be easily undone, and that the claiming of land that had already belonged to people was a thing that sat uneasily on him, even as he had himself bought 40 acres in New Mexico from a land agent whose claims of title were, at the very least, questionable in their origins. It was the kind of honest discomfort that Theresa had always valued in a person, the willingness to name a wrong without pretending you were untouched by it. They rode together on Sundays, Theresa on her father's old gray horse, Cornelius on Dust, and they went out into the country east of town, where the land opened into long pale distances, and the sky was enormous and blue, and they talked or were quiet in equal measure, which is a thing that is harder than most people think, and which says something real about two people when it works. She told him things she had not told the letters. She told him about her mother, about how it had been to lose her at 13, about the specific loneliness of growing up in a store in a small town where everyone knew your name but no one knew the inside of you, about the years of reading everything she could get her hands on because books were the only thing large enough to fill the particular hunger she had. She told him about the offers of marriage she had received over the years, 3 of them, all from perfectly decent men she had liked but not loved, and how she had declined all 3, not knowing at the time why, or not wanting to know, because knowing would have required admitting what she was holding in the box under her bed. He told her about the war's aftermath in Texas, the way it had shaped a generation's relationship to uncertainty and loss, the particular quality of the men he had worked with on the drives, men who carried the residue of enormous violence in the shape of their silences. He told her about James Ockafer, one of the 2 cowboys from his early letters, who was one of the most skilled cattle men he had ever worked with, and who had faced, on every drive through every town, the additional burden of being a black man in a country that had ended legal enslavement 18 years before, but had not yet developed any consistent notion of what that was supposed to mean in practice, and who had met this with a dignity and a sharp intelligence that Cornelius had always admired enormously. He told her that James had bought his own land in Texas and was running a small operation now, and that the last letter he had received from him said things were going well, and his voice when he said it carried the particular warmth of a man talking about a friend he respected. Theresa listened to all of it and understood, through all of it, that what she had known from the letters was real, that the man she had built from 31 pages of his writing was the same man who was sitting across from her on horseback in the Arizona sun, and that this was a rare and remarkable thing. At the end of August, Cornelius sat down with Harold Merritt in the back room of the store and had the conversation that both men had been building toward since the first day. Theresa was not in the room, but she was not far from the door, and she was not particularly ashamed of this. She heard her father ask him what his intentions were, in the plain and direct way that Harold Merritt asked everything, and she heard Cornelius say that his intention was to ask Theresa to marry him, if she would have him, and that he had a 40-acre property in New Mexico that was small but viable and growing, and that he would do everything in his power to see that she had what she needed and wanted, and was not treated as anything other than his full and equal partner in everything that concerned them both. He said this last part with a firmness that Theresa recognized from the letters, the way he said things that mattered as if they were simply facts rather than promises that required performance. Her father was quiet for a moment. "She is the most stubborn person I have ever known," Harold said, "and I say that as the highest possible compliment. She will not be managed." "I know that," Cornelius said. "You've been writing to her for 3 years without a word back." "Yes." "And you still came." "Yes." Another silence. "Well," Harold said, "then I imagine you have a fairly accurate idea of what you're getting into." Theresa put her back against the wall outside the door and pressed her hands over her mouth, and did not make a sound. He asked her that evening on the porch, not with elaborate production but simply and directly, sitting beside her in the evening air with the first cool breath of approaching September moving in from the north, asking her if she would marry him and come to New Mexico and build a life with him on 40 acres of land that needed more work than he could do alone, and that he wanted to share with her, if she would share it. She said yes before he finished the sentence. She said yes, and then she said, "I am going to write you a letter, tonight. And I am going to say everything in it that I should have said 3 years ago, not because it changes anything, because I want you to have it." He looked at her with an expression that was quiet and full. "Then I will read it," he said. She went inside after he left for the hotel, and she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and a fresh sheet of paper and the pen she had dropped on the porch the morning he arrived, and she wrote. She wrote for an hour and a half, filling 3 full pages and the top of a 4th, writing everything she had been unable to write for 3 years. The whole arc of it from the first day he walked into the store to the 31 letters in the box to this evening on the porch. The complete and honest account of what it had been to love someone in silence for 3 years and have them arrive before she could say it. She was not careful with it. She did not cross anything out. She wrote the way you write, when there is nothing left to be afraid of. She folded it and put it in an envelope and wrote his name on the outside, Cornelius Graves, in her careful bookkeeper's hand. And the next morning when he came to the store, she gave it to him without saying anything. And he took it and looked at his name on the envelope and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his chest, and said he would read it at the hotel, and that she would tell him later if there was anything in it she wanted to say out loud, and she said yes. She did not ask him what he thought of it. She knew what he thought of it. She had known from the moment she handed it to him and seen his face, which had done the thing faces do when they receive something they have been waiting a very long time for. The wedding was held in October, when the temperature in the Arizona territory had descended to the merely warm, and the cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to turn, a pale gold that caught the morning light with the particular sweetness of something about to change. Reverend Cole, who served the Baptist contingent of Calico Creek's rotating religious schedule, performed the ceremony in the church with most of the town in attendance, because this was a small town and small towns attended everything, and also because Harold Merritt was well liked and people were happy for him, and because there was something about Cornelius Graves that people liked instinctively, the unhurried directness of him, the way he listened when people talked. The fact that he had spent September helping to fix the school roof without being asked because he had noticed it needed it. Mrs. Adeline Fitch of the hotel wept throughout the ceremony, which she did at every wedding she attended regardless of how well she knew the parties. And Pete Calloway, the schoolteacher, shook Cornelius's hand with the enthusiasm of a man who has genuinely had his roof fixed and felt strongly about it. James Ockhaffer, who Cornelius had written to from Calico Creek, and who had made the journey from Texas because he was that kind of friend, stood beside Cornelius at the front of the church, and afterward ate 3 plates of the wedding supper that the women of the town assembled in the church hall, and talked with Harold Merritt about cattle and land with the ease of 2 people who understood each other's circumstances. Theresa wore her mother's dress, let out at the shoulders and taken in at the waist by a woman named Dolores Vasquez, who had the best needle in 3 counties, and who had pressed the ivory fabric so that it lay smooth and clean as something new. She carried a small bunch of late-season flowers that she had picked herself from the edge of the creek, and she walked down the aisle on her father's arm with the particular composure of a woman who has already said everything she needed to say, and is now simply arriving at the place where the life begins. She looked at Cornelius at the front of the church, and he looked at her with that full, unhurried attention, and she thought, "There is the man I wrote 31 letters worth of love to without ever sending a word," and he looked back at her as if he were thinking something similarly extraordinary. They left for New Mexico 3 days after the wedding. Harold stood on the porch of the store and watched them go, Theresa on a better horse than the old gray, a chestnut mare she had bought with the money she had been saving for years without a clear idea of what she was saving for, and Cornelius on dust, and the wagon with their things tied in the back. Harold had dried his eyes before they turned around, but Theresa knew. She knew and was grateful and waved from the bend in the road until she could not see him anymore. The journey to New Mexico territory took 4 days through country that Cornelius described as they rode through it with the same quality she had recognized in his letters, the way he saw landscape as something to understand rather than simply endure, pointing out the way the desert changed in character as they moved east, the vegetation altering, the color of the soil shifting, the mountain ranges rising and falling on the horizon like long, slow breaths. She paid attention. She had always been a person who paid attention to things, which was part of why the letters had affected her so deeply. They were written by someone who also paid attention, and here was the thing being paid attention to in real life, and it was better than she had imagined. The property was in a valley in the southern part of New Mexico territory, and she had constructed it in her imagination from the one letter in which he had described it, written 6 months ago when he had first broken ground on the cabin. The actual valley was better. The actual valley was surrounded on 3 sides by low mountains that went rust and amber in the afternoon light, and there was a stream running through it that was considerably more substantial than Calico Creek in August, and the grass along the stream was thick and real. The cabin was small and rough-hewn and genuine, with a stone chimney and a good door and 2 windows with proper shutters, and there was a barn that smelled of clean hay and horses, and 24 cattle grazing in the near field with the unhurried authority of animals who have decided this is an acceptable place to be. Gideon Walsh, Cornelius's partner in the property, was a broad-shouldered man of about 55 with a face that had been outdoors for every single one of those years, and a manner that was gruff at the edges and warm at the core. He had known Cornelius was bringing a wife, and he had made up the cabin with what preparations were within his capabilities, which meant the floor had been swept, and there were clean sheets on the rope-strung bed, and someone had put a bunch of dried wildflowers in a tin cup on the windowsill. An effort that touched Theresa so much she made sure to thank him for it with enough specificity that he could not wave it away, which he was clearly inclined to do. Gideon had a small shelter he had built for himself near the barn, and he retired there early in the evenings with the tactful discretion of a man who understood that newlyweds needed their privacy, and also that the cabin was not large enough to comfortably accommodate 3 people at supper. He ate with them at midday when the day's work brought them all together, and Theresa quickly came to appreciate him for his knowledge and for his company, which was the kind of company that understood silence and did not try to fill every moment of it. The first winter on the property was hard work and deep contentment. Theresa threw herself into the business of the ranch with the same thoroughness she had always given to things that mattered to her, learning from Gideon and from Cornelius and from the land itself, which in the territorial Southwest had a way of teaching you what it required if you were willing to listen. She learned to mend fence and to make soap and to put up provisions against the winter in ways that were different from what she had done at the store, more immediate, more tied to the specific animals and seasons of this particular piece of ground. She found she loved it with a fierceness that surprised her, not because she had expected to dislike it, but because she had not expected love to arrive this quickly and this absolutely. And she loved Cornelius Graves in the winter of their first year with a fullness that made the 3 years of kept letters feel less like wasted time and more like the necessary accumulation of everything that had brought her to this. This man in this cabin on this piece of land in the last reach of a century that had been shaped by distances that required faith to cross. She found that love in the small, ordinary hours of the day was different from love at a distance, richer and more specific, full of textures she could not have imagined from a letter. She loved the way he moved through the morning, deliberate and quiet, getting the fire going before she woke, the smell of coffee already in the air when she opened her eyes. She loved the way he talked to the cattle, and to Dust with the same tone he used for her, not because he confused them, but because he had a fundamental respect for the animate world that expressed itself consistently. She loved the way he listened when she talked, not with the half-attention of someone waiting to speak, but with real attention, the kind that remembers what was said. She began keeping a journal in the new year, not because she thought someone would read it, but because the habit of writing that the letters had seeded in her was looking for more room. She wrote about the ranch and the season and the country and her husband, and she wrote with the same honesty she had finally achieved in the letter she gave him on the morning after he asked her to marry him, without crossing things out or smoothing them into something more acceptable. She wrote what was true. In the spring of 1884, she wrote that she was expecting their first child. She wrote it in the journal first, as if putting it on paper made it more real, and then she told Cornelius over breakfast, watching his face go through the series of things faces go through at news of that size, disbelief, and then certainty, and then something large and bright that settled into a particular quietness. He wore the rest of the day, going about the morning's work with that expression on him like weather. He sat beside her on the cabin steps that evening and put his arm around her shoulders, the night coming down soft and cool from the mountains, and said, "I thought the day you walked down the aisle toward me was the best day of my life." She leaned her head against his shoulder. And now I think I may have spoken too soon," he said. She laughed and pressed her face against the worn cloth of his shirt and felt the evening air around them, the mountains dark against the sky, the stream running quiet in its bed below the cabin, the cattle settling in the far field for the night. She thought about the box under the bed in Calico Creek, which she had brought with her when they left, which now sat under the bed in the cabin, 31 letters and the one she had written back, all of them, the whole correspondence of a love that had been conducted in one direction for 3 years and had somehow, against the reasonable odds of the world, arrived at this. The baby came in November, a boy, delivered with the assistance of a woman named Maria Salcedo, who lived a half-day's ride south, and was the nearest thing to a midwife the valley had. He was healthy and loud, and took the world under vigorous protest from the first moment, which Cornelius said he respected. They named him Harold, for Theresa's father, and Cornelius wrote a letter to Lampasas to tell his mother. And Harold Merritt himself arrived from Calico Creek in December, making the 4-day journey at 60 years old with the determination of a grandfather. And he sat by the fire holding his grandson with the expression of a man whose heart has expanded to contain something he had not known it had room for. He stayed for 2 weeks and helped with the winter work, and talked with Cornelius in the evenings with the ease and warmth of a real relationship rather than the formal politeness of in-laws. And when he left, Theresa stood on the valley road and watched him go and felt the particular bittersweet quality of a goodbye to someone you love in a place where you have also found love, the richness of being in the right place even when it is far from other people who are right. The ranch grew. Slowly, and with the particular combination of planning and luck and hard work, and occasional disaster that all real growth requires, the 40 acres of the Walsh and Graves operation expanded to 60, and then 80 through the purchase of the adjoining parcel, when old Ezra Pike decided he was done with the territory and wanted to go to California for his remaining years. They added cattle and a second barn, and a summer kitchen that Theresa designed herself, having thought long and hard about the correct positioning of windows and the usefulness of a covered workspace in a climate that was 10 months of sun and 2 of genuine winter cold. Gideon Walsh continued as their partner and near neighbor and daily presence, his shelter near the barn having expanded over the years into something more genuinely habitable. And he had developed a relationship with young Harold that combined the particular patience and good humor of a man who had somehow skipped fatherhood and arrived at grandfatherhood with no intermediate steps. And Harold adored him with the uncritical wholeheartedness of a small child who recognizes a good person. In 1886, Theresa found she was expecting again, and this time the child arrived in the spring, a girl they named Clara, for Cornelius's mother, who had been born Clara Graham in Georgia in 1830 and had made it through more than most people do, and who sent a letter from Texas so full of warmth and welcome that Theresa read it 3 times and then kept it in the box with Cornelius's letters, because it belonged there, because it was the family that had grown from those words. The box was fuller now. She had stopped thinking of it as a container of something she was ashamed of, the evidence of the 3 years she had spent not writing back, and had come to think of it as the origin of something, the place where the story had been keeping itself while she found the courage to enter it. The 31 letters from the drives, and the 1 letter she had written back the night he proposed, and the letter from Cornelius's mother, and she had begun to add letters from James Ocaffer in Texas, and from Harold Merritt in Calico Creek, the correspondence of a life that had opened from the narrow beginning of a box under a bed. She showed the box to Clara and to Harold when they were old enough to understand stories, telling them the story of the letters as a kind of family mythology, the father who wrote 31 times to a woman who never answered, the woman who kept every letter under her bed, the morning she finally decided to write back and found him standing in the street. Harold, who was by then a serious and observant 5-year-old, listened to this with grave attention and then said, "Why didn't you just write back right away?" And Theresa looked at Cornelius over the top of their son's head, and Cornelius looked back at her with the expression she loved most on his face, the one that was quiet and warm and entirely present. "Because some things take time to become brave enough for," she told Harold. "But once you are brave enough, you have to go all the way." "Papa was brave enough," Harold said. "Papa was very brave," she agreed. Cornelius took Harold on his knee and looked at Theresa above the child's head and said, very quietly, "So were you. Eventually." In 1887, Calico Creek sent news that Harold Merritt had taken ill, a winter illness that had settled in his chest and refused to leave. Theresa was on the road to Arizona before the letter had finished drying, Cornelius riding with her, having arranged the ranch in Gideon Walsh's capable hands and left without a second thought, because she needed to go and he was going with her, and that was the full extent of the decision. They arrived to find Harold diminished but present, thinner and slower and still completely himself, still sorting the account books in the back room, still reading everything he could get his hands on, still the man she had grown up loving. The illness had taken something from him, but not the essential quality of him, the thoughtfulness and the quiet humor and the absolute reliability of his affection. He recovered slowly through the spring and summer, with Theresa and Cornelius staying far longer than either of them had planned, because leaving felt impossible while he was still uncertain. The children, who had come on the wagon with them, discovered Calico Creek with the enthusiasm of children discovering a new world, and Harold Merritt moved through his partial recovery wrapped in the extraordinary business of grandchildren, which Theresa privately believed was a more effective medicine than anything Doc Simmons was able to offer. By July, Harold was on his feet with something close to his old energy, and Mrs. Adeline Fitch from the hotel, who had survived into her late 70s with undiminished authority, declared that Harold Merritt was too stubborn to die before he was ready, and that the town would simply have to accommodate this. There was general agreement. Before they left in August to return to New Mexico, Theresa sat with her father on the porch one evening after the children were in bed and Cornelius was down at the livery checking on Dust, who had developed a mild lameness on the journey and needed attention. Harold was in the rocking chair with a cup of coffee and the comfortable ease of a man who has recently survived something and is taking his time about appreciating the survival. "You are happy," he said. It was not a question. "I am so happy," she said, "more than I knew how to expect." "I always thought you would be," he said. "When he came through the first time I thought there is a man who actually looks at things. People who actually look at things are rare. He writes about things the same way," she said. "I know," her father said. "I read one of his letters once. You left the box on the kitchen table and I was going to move it and the lid came open and I read one letter before I closed it. I was not proud of that, but I was glad I did it." She looked at him. "Which one?" "The one about the prairie in winter light," he said. "About how it had no other name." She felt her throat close a little with something that was not unhappiness. "That was an early one," she said. "I know," he said. "That's when I knew you were going to have a hard time writing back." She laughed despite herself, the laugh that surprised you out of almost tears, and reached over and took his hand and held it in both of hers. "Thank you for not saying anything," she said. "You were working it out," he said. "People work things out at their own pace. The only time you need to intervene is if they stop working." "He did not stop," she said. "He just came." "No," her father said. "He did not stop." They left for New Mexico in the second week of August with the wagon loaded, and the children in good spirits and Harold Merritt standing on the porch of the store in the morning light, smaller than he had been but fundamentally himself, raising his hand in the slow wave that meant goodbye for now. And Theresa turned in the wagon seat and watched until the turn in the road took the porch and the store and her father from view, and then she turned forward and looked at the country opening ahead of them. The long pale distances of the Arizona territory giving way to the mountains of New Mexico, the road going east into the morning. Cornelius was driving, and he reached over without looking and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand under his and laced her fingers through his and held on. The ranch in the fall of 1887 was larger and more settled than the one they had left, Gideon Walsh having managed it with the competence and attentiveness of a man who took responsibilities seriously. And the cattle were in good condition, and the second barn was standing solidly, and there had been enough rain through the summer to keep the grass thick in the near fields. They came home to it in the late afternoon of the fourth day's riding, coming down from the northern pass into the valley with the mountains amber around them, and the cabin's chimney already putting up a thin line of smoke, because Gideon had seen them from the upper pasture and had gone ahead to get the fire started, and Theresa felt the particular deep rightness of arriving at a place that is genuinely yours, that carries the specific gravity of everything you have put into it. Young Harold said, "We are home," with the proprietary certainty of a 6-year-old who has no doubts about where he belongs, and Clara, 3 years old and possessed of opinions beyond her years, said, "I want to see the cows," and Cornelius laughed and said he had always known she would take after him in the things that mattered, and Theresa thought, "This is it, this is the whole of it, this valley and this cabin and these 2 children and this man. This is the life that grew from a box of letters that I was too afraid to answer for 3 years." She got down from the wagon and walked to the cabin door and opened it, and the fire was crackling in the stone hearth, and the room smelled of wood smoke, and the dried herbs she kept in bunches from the rafters, and the faint particular smell of home that is always different and always unmistakable. She went to the bed and crouched down and pulled the box from beneath it. She opened it. The letters were all there, the blue ribbon bundles and the green ribbon bundles and the navy ribbon bundles, and the letter she had written him the night he proposed, and the letter from his mother, and the letters from Harold in Calico Creek and from James Ocaffer in Texas. She ran her finger along the edges of the bundles and thought about the woman who had assembled them, the 22-year-old woman behind the counter in the store who had said yes to letters before she had finished thinking what yes meant, and the 25-year-old woman who had stood on the porch on a Monday morning in August with a blank piece of paper in her hand and watched a man step out of a stagecoach, and the woman she was now. She heard Cornelius come in behind her, heard him set his hat on the peg inside the door, heard his boots on the floorboards. "Box inventory?" he asked. "Something like that," she said. He came and crouched beside her and looked into the open box with the same attention he had given it that first evening on her father's porch in 1883. "I want to add one more thing to it," he said. She looked at him. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, where she knew he kept the letter she had written him the night he proposed, had kept it there every day since she gave it to him, and he took out not that letter but a new folded piece of paper, which he held out to her. She took it and unfolded it. It was dated that morning, the day they had left Calico Creek to come home. It was in his handwriting, the same handwriting she had been reading for 7 years, and it was not long, only 1 page, but it was the whole of things, written with the same quality all his letters had always had, the honesty and the warmth and the sense of paying full attention. It said, in part, "I have been writing to you since 1880, and I intend to keep writing to you for the rest of my life, not because the letters need to go anywhere now. We are in the same house and share the same table, and I could simply say these things out loud, but because writing to you is how I understood my own heart from the beginning, and I see no reason to stop a practice that has served me so well. You kept my letters in a box for 3 years before I arrived. I hope you will keep this one in the same box beside the others, so that the beginning and the middle and what comes next are all together in one place." She read it twice and folded it back along its original creases and put it in the box, beside the first bundle with the blue ribbon, which was where it belonged. "You are going to make me cry," she said. "Then I have succeeded," he said, and she heard the smile in it and turned to look at him, his face close to hers in the firelight of their own cabin, and she put her hand against his jaw the way she had done 10,000 times in the 4 years of their marriage, and he leaned into it the way he had always done, and the fire crackled, and outside the children were talking to Gideon Walsh, with the enthusiastic incoherence of small children reuniting with a beloved figure. And the mountains held the valley in their amber evening arms, and the stream ran in its course below the cabin, and the cattle moved in the far field with their unhurried authority, and everything was exactly, precisely right. The years that followed settled into the rhythm of a life that was hard and good in equal and sustaining measure. The ranch continued to grow, not rapidly, but solidly, the way things grow when they are properly tended, and by 1890 they had expanded to 120 acres and had a reputation in the valley for good cattle and fair dealing that brought them neighbors who became friends and customers who became regulars, and a standing in the community that felt like something earned rather than simply assumed. Harold, at 9, was already the kind of boy who would clearly become the kind of man his father was, patient and observant and competent, happiest when he was working, with a particular gift for the animals that Cornelius attributed to either heredity or stubbornness, and which Theresa thought were probably the same thing. Clara, at 6, was her mother's child in the ways that mattered, fierce and curious and possessed of opinions she expressed with full confidence, and her father's child in the ways that also mattered, with a tenderness for the natural world that expressed itself in the form of rescued birds and careful attention to the behavior of the creek in different seasons. Gideon Walsh, in 1890, announced at supper one evening in his customary direct fashion that he had been corresponding with a widow woman in Santa Fe named Josephine Reed, who had been the wife of a ranch man and who had been running her own small property since her husband's death 2 years previous, and that he intended to go to Santa Fe and introduce himself in person. He said this with the slight defiant quality of a man who expects to be teased and is prepared to defend himself. Cornelius said, carefully and with complete seriousness, that he thought it was a fine thing, and that Josephine Reed sounded like a sensible woman for having the good judgment to respond to his letters. Theresa watched Cornelius say this and thought about boxes of letters and courage, and the particular stubbornness required to keep writing to someone who has not yet found their way to writing back. Gideon went to Santa Fe. He came back with Josephine, who was a sharp-eyed woman of 48 with a direct manner and a genuine warmth underneath it, and an opinion about everything from cattle management to the territorial politics that she stated without apology, and which Theresa liked immediately and completely. They were married at the property that spring, Reverend Cole having made the journey from Calico Creek for the occasion because Cornelius had written to him, and he was that kind of man, and the ceremony was small and honest, and the supper afterward was large and generous and lasted until the stars were fully out over the mountains. Harold Merritt came for that wedding too, his health restored to something close to its old reliability, and he brought with him the intelligence that Calico Creek had grown. A new family had taken the old Pearson place east of town and were planting an orchard, and the school had doubled its enrollment, and the hotel had been expanded, though Mrs. Adeline Fitch maintained that she had not given permission for any of the expansion decisions and had been overruled by forces she did not respect. Calico Creek endured, as small towns in the Arizona Territory had always endured, through the force of the people who had decided it was worth enduring for. He also brought news that James Acafer had written to him, having somehow found Harold Merritt through the chain of letters, and knowing that letters found Calico Creek reliably. James's operation in Texas was doing well. He had 400 head and 2 hired hands, and he sent his regards to Cornelius and his congratulations to Theresa, whom he had never met but felt he knew from the way Cornelius had talked about her on every drive they had shared. Theresa wrote back to James Acafer that fall, the first of what became a regular correspondence, and found in his letters the same quality of real attention and clear seeing that she had always valued, and thought that Cornelius had been right about him, that he was exactly the kind of person the letters had described. In 1891, Theresa and Cornelius received a letter from Cornelius's mother in Lampasas, Texas, informing them that Clara Graves, 71 years old, had decided she was coming to New Mexico for a visit and would arrive by stage in the 3rd week of April. It was not exactly an inquiry. Cornelius read the letter at breakfast and said, with the smile of a man who recognizes a maternal force of nature, that his mother had the same general approach to announcements that a weather system did. Clara Graves arrived in April and was exactly as the letters and Cornelius's descriptions had suggested, small and formidable and warm, with her son's eyes and his particular quality of attention, and a capacity for work that left even Gideon Walsh looking impressed. She spent 3 weeks at the ranch, and in that time reorganized the root cellar, had comprehensive opinions about the condition of the kitchen garden, formed a strong alliance with young Harold on the basis of their shared interest in practical problem-solving, and told Theresa in private, on an afternoon when they were putting up preserves together in the summer kitchen, that she had been right about her when Cornelius first wrote, and said he had met a woman in Arizona who he thought might be worth knowing. "He wrote to you about me?" Theresa asked. "The very first letter he sent after coming through Calico Creek in 1880, Clara Graves said, cutting pears with the decisive efficiency of someone who had been doing exactly this for 50 years. He said there was a woman in Arizona who had eyes that paid attention to things. He said he was going to write to her." She looked up at Theresa with a look that contained everything she had felt for 11 years about this development. "I thought, if he writes to her, she will answer. Boys who write to women are generally boys who understand something about the world that the others don't." "I didn't answer for 3 years," Theresa said. "No," Clara said, "but you kept the letters." Theresa thought about that. "How did you know I kept the letters?" she asked. "Because Cornelius told me," Clara said simply. "After he came back from Calico Creek with a wife and a story worth telling. He told me you had kept every single one of them in a box under your bed, tied up with ribbon." Theresa looked at her mother-in-law's small and capable hands moving over the pears. "What did you think of that?" she asked. "I thought," Clara Graves said, "that a woman who keeps a man's letters for 3 years while she figures out how to be brave enough to deserve them is exactly the right woman for a man like my son." She looked up again. "And I was right." Theresa thought she might cry again, the same way the letter by the fire had almost made her cry, and she pressed her lips together and kept putting up preserves and said nothing except "thank you," which was insufficient and also the only thing there was to say. Clara went back to Lampasas in May with the stated intention of returning the following year, and the additional stated intention of bringing Cornelius's sister Mary and Mary's husband and their children, because she had decided the family needed to consolidate, and the ranch in New Mexico was the obvious place to do it. Cornelius said he had been expecting exactly this development since the moment his mother arrived, and had in fact been quietly expanding the water capacity of the property in anticipation. Theresa wrote to her father that evening, the long familiar letter she wrote him every month, and told him about Clara's visit and about the preserves, and about what his granddaughter had said that morning at breakfast, which was that she wanted to learn to read proper maps so she could know where everything was, a statement that Harold Merritt wrote back to say was the most sensible thing he had heard in some time. In the early winter of 1892, Theresa opened the box one evening while the children were in bed and Cornelius was writing at the table, the lamp making a warm pool of light on the pages he was working over, and she counted what was inside. 31 letters from the drives. 1 letter she had written back. 2 letters from Cornelius written since their marriage, this one from the day they left Calico Creek to come home, and one he had written on their 5th anniversary and slipped under the box for her to find. Letters from her father and from James Acaffer and from Clara Graves and from Josephine Walsh and from various people in the valley and from the world. The box was nearly full now. She closed it and pushed it back under the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the room she had made in this cabin, the curtains she had sewn from fabric her father had sent, the rag rug on the floor, the shelf of books she had accumulated over the years, the dried herbs and the winter firelight, and the man at the table with his pen moving across the page. She thought about the morning in August of 1883 when she had stood on the porch with a blank piece of paper in her hand and watched him step out of a stagecoach, and she thought about how close it had come to never happening at all, How easily 3 years of silence could have become permanent. How his patience could have finally run out. How she could have written that first letter and found no one on the other end of it. She thought about how it was the distance that had done it. The way love at a distance had to be carried entirely by words and faith. No touch or presence to lean on. Just the letters coming from farther and farther away and accumulating in the box. And how the distance had made her afraid because it had stripped away everything except what was actually there. The real thing under all the practical reasons and the ordinary days. And the real thing had been enormous. She thought about how he had come, how he had simply gotten on a stage and come, before she could write back, before she could prepare what she wanted to say, arriving into the middle of her life with the matter-of-fact certainty of a man who had decided something mattered and was going to act on it, and how that had been the bravest thing she had ever seen, and the most like him of anything she could have imagined. She got up from the bed and went to the table and sat down across from him, and he looked up from his writing. "What are you working on?" she asked. "Letter to James," he said. "He's thinking of expanding into New Mexico territory. I told him there's good land in the valley north of here and that the man who currently holds the north parcel is looking to sell. He would be a fine neighbor," she said. "He would be an excellent neighbor," Cornelius said. She reached across the table and took his hand, the long-fingered hand she had known from his letters before she had known it in life, and he turned it and held hers. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the morning you arrived." He was watching her with that full attention, the lamplight warm on his face. "Which morning?" "The August morning in 1883. You stepped off the stage and I was standing on the porch with a blank piece of paper. I had finally decided to write to you that day." "I know," he said. "I was 4 hours too late." He looked at her for a moment, the particular expression of a man who has thought about this thoroughly and arrived at peace with it. "You were not too late," he said. "You were exactly on time. If you had written, I would have written back, and we would have continued the correspondence for another season or two, and eventually the situation would have demanded resolution one way or another. The way it happened is better." "How is it better?" "Because when I stepped off that stage and saw you on the porch with a pen in your hand and flour on your hands and the most startled expression I have ever seen on a human face," he said, I knew in about 4 seconds that everything I had been thinking about you for 3 years was correct. And that is a very good thing to know in 4 seconds, rather than having to work up to it over another year of letters." She looked at him and thought that she had been right in her very first assessment, that first Monday morning in the store in 1880, that he was a man who knew how to be polite without being hollow about it, and that she had simply undersold how far that quality went, how it went all the way down, all the way to the bottom of him, real and clear and warm. "I love you," she said. "I should have said it in the 7th letter. I am still saying it now." "I know you are," he said. "I am still saying it back." Outside the cabin, the New Mexico Territory night was enormous and cold and full of stars, and the valley lay quiet in its circle of mountains, and the stream ran in its course below the cabin with a sound that had become as familiar as breathing, and in the box under the bed 31 letters and all the rest waited in their ribbon-tied bundles for the children who would someday read them and understand the particular shape of how their parents had come to each other. The distance and the silence and the faith and the arrival, the love that had been kept in a box for 3 years before it found its voice, and the man who had come before she could write back, and everything that had grown. From that, the lamp burned on the table between them, and they sat with their hands clasped in the warm light of their own house, and the night outside was the same night that had always been out there, the wild and ancient dark of the territorial West, and inside was theirs. The fire and the books and the sleeping children and the life, the whole of it, complete. Harold Merritt came for Christmas that year and brought the news that Calico Creek had its first telegraph office and that Mrs. Adeline Fitch had sent her first telegraph message, which had apparently taken 45 minutes and 3 visits from the telegraph operator to compose, and had ultimately said simply that she was well and expected the same from the recipient. Calico Creek found this entirely characteristic. In the spring of 1893, the valley north of the ranch changed hands and James Ackhafer came with his cattle and his 2 hired hands, and the valley became something more than a ranch. It became a community, people who had chosen each other and who had work in common and history in common, and who ate supper together on Sunday evenings in the summer with the easy comfort of people who have decided on each other and found the decision sound. James Ackhafer and Cornelius stood at the fence line between the 2 properties one afternoon, watching the cattle in the near field, talking in the shorthand of men who have known each other a long time, and Theresa watched them from the porch with Clara beside her, who had come back as she promised she would, and thought that this was the thing letters could not carry but life could, the specific weight and texture of people who had become part of your world. Harold Merritt lived until 1897, dying in the fall at 70 years old in the store he had run for nearly 4 decades, with the account books in order and the shelves properly stocked, and his daughter's last letter on the table beside his bed. He went with the same quiet completeness that had characterized everything he had ever done, and Calico Creek grieved him with the authentic grief of a small town losing one of its genuinely irreplaceable people. Theresa and Cornelius and the children went to Arizona for the burial, and she stood at the grave in the Calico Creek Cemetery, with the October wind coming down from the north and the cottonwoods along the creek putting up their gold, and Cornelius stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders, and she thought about her father's voice saying you were working it out. People work things out at their own pace, and about the way he had read one letter and said nothing, and about all the mornings he had let her be exactly who she was without requiring anything else. She sold the store to a young couple from Tucson who intended to expand it, which she thought Harold would have approved of, and she kept the building's account books for herself because they were in his handwriting and she wanted to keep that. She put them in the box when she got home. The box, by 1897, was genuinely full, and she transferred its contents to a larger cedar chest that Cornelius built for her in the evenings after supper, careful and precise joinery, the kind of work he did when he cared about what he was making. She moved everything into it, all the letters and the account books and the letter from his mother and the letters from James and from Harold and from Josephine and from everyone who had ever written anything that belonged to the life of this place and these people. The cedar chest sat at the foot of the bed. On the morning she moved everything into it. She stood in the bedroom with the old wooden box in her hands, empty now for the first time in 17 years, and felt the particular lightness of something completed and preserved rather than lost. She turned the box over in her hands, the green patina on the brass latch, the slight scuff on the left corner from years of being slid under and out from under the bed. Cornelius came in from the morning's work and found her standing there and looked at the empty box and at her face. "All right?" he asked. "All right," she said. "More than all right." She looked up at him. "I was just thinking about what this held, what it started as." He came to her and took the box from her hands and set it on the shelf, gently, as if it deserved to be kept. "It started as a place to keep something you were not ready to let go of," he said. "That seems like the right use for a box." She put her hands on his chest, feeling the familiar worn cloth of his work shirt and the warmth of him underneath it, and looked at him in the morning light of the bedroom window, the man who had written to her 31 times from every dust-colored corner of the West, and then gotten on a stage and come, arriving into the ordinary morning of her life like something the landscape had been keeping for her. "I love you," she said, for the 10,000th time, because it did not diminish with repetition, because the most true things rarely do. "I love you," he said back, for the 10,000th time, "for every letter I wrote and every letter you kept and every letter you finally wrote back, and for every morning after and every morning ahead." Outside, the cedar chest held its preserved weight of words, the beginning and the middle and the long good years, the whole correspondence of a love that had been made at a distance and then lived close, The letters that had crossed a continent and found their way to a box under a bed, and waited there with the patient faith of things that know they are kept, that know they are not lost, that know eventually the door will open and the person will come in and the words will finally have somewhere real to go. And they did. They always would.